Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Good. So yeah, the return of the peregrine. And the reason I've called it the return of the peregrine is because peregrines disappeared from most of England, certainly most of southern England, in the early mid part of the last century, and they have returned. And whereas some birds have returned with our help, such as the red kite, peregrines pretty much managed to do it on their own because we removed all the things that were causing them problems. So I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. But it's a fabulous bird, and I first became involved with them about maybe 15 years ago. It's designed for very fast flight with very strong wings. It's designed for being a killing machine with strong talons, and also designed for chasing things very fast and very accurately with amazing eyesight. Now, the eye of a peregrine, you can only see a small part of it there in that photo, but the eye takes up a huge part of the skull. And indeed, I think I'm right in saying peregrine's eye is actually larger than our eye. So it gives you an idea. You're only seeing a small part of it, and it's a very big eye indeed. The teardrop on the face below the eye is designed really to help the peregrine see in bright conditions. So as they're moving fast, this actually reduces the amount of glare hitting the eye. And you may have noticed, of course, that American football players, indeed some cricketers, use paint on their face to try and do exactly the same thing. It's now been shown that actually peregrines in parts of the world where there's a lot of sunlight, such as in the Middle East, have darker eye stripes than the ones that are in areas where there isn't so much sun. In a lot of places, of course, peregrines are living in very wild conditions. And of course, in Britain, for most of the time, before they started nesting alongside us in cities, they were only found on mountains, and they were only found on cliffs along the south coast. So they have changed their habits, and that's what enabled them to come back in such good numbers. Here's a female peregrine flying with a very, very large area of wing. You can see how big that wing is. Compare that, for example, to a hobby or a kestrel or some other kind of falcon. This is a very, very powerful wing designed for fast flight. The peregrine is the fastest bird in the world. It can go at over 200 miles an hour, which is faster than a Formula One sports car. They have the agility also to turn quickly. Here is a bird that's been going in one direction, suddenly seen something, decided to change direction, and the first thing it does is it puts its wings behind it, and it puts them in very close to the body, flaps a few times, then glides, flaps again, and then eventually turns itself into the shape of a bullet as it comes down at immense speed. They like to do this from above. They don't really chase things on the level. They come straight down on top of whatever they're going to kill. And in many cases around this part of the world, that will be a pigeon. And if you're a feral pigeon living in Southampton, then this is possibly, if you had eyes in the back of your head, this would be the last thing you're going to see. Quite scary, really. And if you like pigeons, here's a feral pigeon for you to enjoy for the moment. If you like pigeons, then the good news is peregrines like them too, probably more than you do. And if you look at the prey that they're eating around Southampton, most of the prey is indeed feral pigeons. Some work done by Nick Dixon and Ed Druitt here, showing their work in Exeter, where they looked at all of the prey being brought into some nests of peregrines around Exeter. And you can see pigeons and doves took up 36% of the prey items. Remember that Exeter, a little bit like Southampton, close to the coast, so therefore there are wading birds in there as well, and we certainly do see suggestions of wading birds being caught, starlings, thrushes, and so on. There's a long list from Exeter of the birds that have been killed, and here is the list. One we've got that they didn't have. We had a stone curlew brought in by a young female peregrine in Southampton in, I think it was in March this year, which I thought was a bit sad, because that's actually one of the other birds I spend my summers studying. But there we go. It wasn't a Hampshire one, it was from Suffolk. And the birds that have been brought in by peregrines include things like this, you know, storm petrel, dipper, black-necked grebe, even a ruddy duck. Must be a few years ago now. Anyway, a few facts and figures about the peregrine. And the main thing to pick up from this is that male peregrines are quite small. And you can see that the largest male peregrine is still smaller than the smallest female peregrine. So females can be up to 1.3 kilos, males can be 0.6 of a kilo. So there's really quite a big difference. And they're always more aggressive females. They're quite the sort of dominant bird, but also quite bullying around the nest site. Male peregrines don't have a particularly easy time when they come in with food. The food is grabbed off them. There's no sort of thank you. It's just grabbed from them and they're sent off to get more. The laying period actually is extending. I think climate change means that peregrines probably now think about nesting a little bit earlier than they used to. So I probably should adjust this slide. It was always about 21st of March. This last year, I think it was the 10th of March we had our first egg. They have a short laying period though, and they usually lay 3 to 4 eggs, very exceptionally 5. And the incubation period is 1 month. That is shared between male and female, although the female takes the majority share of that, particularly overnight. And then about 6 weeks or 7 weeks after they've hatched, the birds will fledge. In other words, they'll be flying. And, you know, and in that first year, they have quite a tough life. They have a very high chance of dying. Between 50 and 70% in some years of peregrine chicks die before they reach their first birthday. So the numbers of chicks does need to be quite high in order to keep the population at a good level. They first breed when they're 2 years old, although I think probably males could breed a little bit earlier than that, but they just lack experience. They're quite clumsy and stupid at that stage. And the oldest bird that I know of is 21 years old. So they do have the ability to live for a long, long time. As I said, they are very different in size, and this is a real pair, Beauty and Archer from the Midlands. Now, Beauty and Archer would not sit next to each other like that. So this is actually a divided photograph where they both sat on the same entrance part of the nest box. But they've been put there artificially. There's no way that Beauty would allow Archer to sit next to her like that. He on the right is quite small. He looks kind of cute. You know, you almost feel like you go and stroke him, whereas you probably wouldn't feel the same thing about Beauty. And I think the other thing to notice that in the male bird, the eye looks a lot bigger in the head because the head is quite a lot smaller. And I think the eye is the same size so as the female. So basically the eye looks quite big. He is usually quite bright and white. She is usually a little bit mottled and buffy colored around the front. And if you want to know more about peregrines, and there's plenty of books available, a classic piece of literature by J.A. Baker on the right, which is actually fantastic prose, although I'm not convinced that all of the birds that Baker saw were actually peregrines. I think some of them were kestrels because he talks about them hovering a lot. But the book by Dick Treleaven on the left is a classic piece of work from his studies in Cornwall. Derek Ratcliffe has 2 versions of his book, which is the absolute masterpiece on peregrines. And then 2 recent books. And I particularly like the one on the right by Ed Druitt, who I mentioned earlier. His work on urban peregrines is really good indeed. There are around the world 19 different races of peregrines. Some of them have been treated as separate species in their own right, but they are currently all considered to be one bird, the peregrine falcon. But they look slightly different, a bit more buffy in the deserts. And in terms of size, the ones that nest in the Arctic are huge, almost like a buzzard, and the ones in Africa are really small, almost like a hobby. So they do vary a lot. And they're not just up in the skies chasing pigeons. You know, they will actually feed on the ground, pick up worms and things like that, particularly in the winter, if there isn't anything they can find flying around. And back in the early days, between the 1950s and the 1990s, you know, we had very few peregrines appearing in Hampshire in the summer. It's very much a winter bird. So this is all the months between January and December. January on the left, December on the right, and you can see numbers tail off because they are, or they were back at that time, just a winter visitor to Hampshire. And a lot of those birds would have come from Scandinavia. This is actually a map of all the ringing recoveries associated with peregrines in the UK. And what you can see here is the yellow dots up around Scandinavia. These are all birds ringed as chicks in Scandinavia that made it to the UK during the winter. And the purple ones are birds ringed as babies in Britain that went away down to Spain and France and indeed Africa. So there is a sort of swapping over of populations. So when you see a peregrine in the winter down on the marshes off Southampton, it may well be a local bird, but there's a good chance it could have come all the way from Scandinavia. 85% of foreign ringed peregrines found in Britain have come from Scandinavia. Well, over the years, peregrines have had three major problems, which has caused them to be really scarce at certain times. First of all, their eggs are very attractive in colour. Here's a sample of some eggs collected over the years by collectors. Different colour shades, different numbers of eggs. And that was a real problem. And indeed, John Walpole Bond, who was the county bird recorder for Sussex about 100 years ago, he was an avid egg collector, and he collected all the peregrine clutches off the cliffs of Sussex. You can see he even put peregrine on his second volume of his book on the history of Sussex birds. The second problem is that, as I mentioned, peregrines like to eat pigeons. And during the Second World War, pigeons were a vital part of the communication of information from people based in Europe who wanted to tell us back home what was going on in the war effort, secret messages. And indeed, soldiers were using pigeons all the time. Bomber pilots used to carry pigeons as well, because if they crashed and they survived, they'd need to let people back home know that they had survived, and the pigeon was the way they would do that. So the government decided that we should shoot all of the peregrines on the south coast, because peregrines were killing those pigeons with those vital messages. So they were all killed. None were left after the Second World War. And after the war, we started to see pesticides being developed, hugely powerful pesticides which had the ability to improve our crop yields, but those pesticides made their way into the bodies of small birds, pigeons, and they were eaten by the peregrines. And the peregrines suffered in two ways. Their eggshells became thin, and they themselves quite often died from being poisoned by those pesticides. So to go back to the 1960s, this is the situation from the first BTO atlas. Now you can see there are no birds around Southampton at all breeding. There are hardly any at all in eastern and central England. There are some in the southwest around Cornwall and Devon, but they were so scared about those birds' eggs being taken or them being pestered in some way, they kept them in a circle just to keep them secret. Up in Scotland and in Wales and so on, the population was doing quite well. Now let's roll right forward to the most recent atlas, which finished amazingly about 10 years ago now. You can see the change. All of those upright triangles are actually places where peregrines have moved in and have started to breed where they were not breeding back in the 60s. But the upside down black triangles are places where peregrines have now left. And that's quite a shock, because if you look up to, say, Shetland, at the very top of the screen, you'll see peregrines have left Shetland completely. There are hardly any left in Orkney. Along the coast of Scotland, there are very few. Now, there are a number of things that probably are causing this. First of all, there are quite a lot of people who don't like birds of prey, and quite a lot of those people live in Scotland and Northern England, so that may be something to do with it. But there's also a bigger problem, I think, and that is that there is mercury in the seas, mercury finding its way into our fish stocks. And because of that, we're finding probably that peregrines are declining through, again, poisoning from their prey. They're eating seabirds in Scotland on the coast rather than pigeons, and those seabirds are already containing metals in their bodies. So I think there's a poisoning issue. There's also a problem that the number of seabirds have declined due to climate change. It means that the fish stocks that they are looking for are now further away from the coast, further north, and birds that have to go and get fish have to go further, and they can't bring back enough fish to raise as many chicks as before. So their populations are declining. So basically, it's a situation with two results. One where in places like Scotland, the population's declining, but in England, the population's going up. Now, if we look at the atlas in detail, you can see on the left there the years where peregrines either returned to nest or started nesting for the very first time on some of those counties. So places like the Isle of Wight and Kent and Sussex, that's where they returned to because they were already nesting on the cliffs. But in Hampshire, they'd never nested. So 1993 was the first time they nested in Hampshire. And the same was true, of course, in places like Surrey and Berkshire and also in London. If you look at the Hampshire Bird Atlas, and if you haven't got that, we've only got 2 copies left now in Hoss. That's been a very successful book. This is the maps from that book for peregrine. So the left-hand map shows you the breeding distribution. The green areas just simply show you areas where peregrines were seen during the breeding season, and the dots indicate density. And if you look at the right-hand map, that shows you the distribution in the winter. So many more peregrines around in Hampshire in the winter, and that's partly because there are lots of young birds from the previous summer looking for somewhere to live, plus you've got these birds that come in from Scandinavia. So it's a lot easier to see a peregrine in the winter than it is in the summer. The numbers in the breeding surveys of the last few years is quite interesting. So back in 1961, just 385 pairs of peregrines across the whole of the UK, really quite low. The latest survey put it at 1769, and I think now it's probably just over 2,000. As I indicated, it's not equal. Wales, Scotland, or the Isle of Man saw declines between the last survey and the one before, whereas in Northern Ireland and England, they increased. So the history in Hampshire is back in 1993. And of course, this chimney came down just a few weeks ago, but that is where the very first pair of Hampshire peregrines nested, up on that chimney, not in the white part at the very top, but on the fawny coloured part, not too far down. And they nested there almost every year from 1993 to the current year. They did nest this year. They had a couple of chicks. I can talk a bit more about that if you want later, but there are discussions underway as to how we help those peregrines to find a new home. In 1995, a pair nested on pylons just outside Southampton, and indeed quite a few nested along that corridor of pylons that go all the way from Fawley all the way up to Nursling. And they don't nest in those now, mainly because the National Grid people, when they service those pylons, they block off all the places where peregrines could nest. This is quite a funny one. This is a huge crane. It's currently just off Portsmouth, but I think back in 2004, it was, I think, off Southampton. And this is called Canute, and it's a floating crane. Canute can be moved from ship to ship in order to move heavy things around. And in 2004, there was a very heavy lifting job that was required to be done down in Cowes on the Isle of Wight. So the crane went to the Isle of Wight, but actually had a pair of peregrines nesting on it. And the female remained on the nest during the journey, all the way down to the Isle of Wight. She went all the way down to Cowes and they did the heavy lifting job. And then a few days later, she came back. The male stayed in Southampton throughout that time. So the funny thing about that is that even gets a mention in the Isle of Wight bird report for 2004, on the basis that nesting peregrines were present for 2 days, which I thought was quite cheeky. They're Hampshire birds. This is the number of pairs from 1993 to the current year. And as you can see, it was a slow start. It took a long time to get going. And then it increased quite quickly over the last sort of 15 years or so. Now, part of that might be my interest growing in them. I encouraged a number of people, some of them on the call tonight, I think, who actually have helped me to monitor those nests and keep an eye on these birds. Plus, we've put up a number of boxes for them. I personally think it's fantastic having peregrines all around us. Other people don't necessarily. I know people like Pete Potts, who counts waders. They get very frustrated because they're counting a flock of waders and they just get to sort of 999 and along comes a peregrine. The whole flock takes off and they have to start again. But, well, I just think peregrines are fantastic, and it's wonderful to have them in our cities and right alongside us so you can see them up close. This is a male. he's actually making the nest. So what we do very often is we have a box and we put this kind of fish tank gravel in the bottom of the box, and he will go down and sort of bury his chest into the gravel and push forward with his feet in order to make a bit of a dent. The female does that as well sometimes. And we have cameras in some of our boxes. And here's the male looking up at the camera, doing a selfie. He probably can see his reflection, I think, just in the lens. Here are the eggs. You can see why people wanted to collect them. They're so beautiful. They really are attractive. And that's actually on a mountain nest. And here's a male. The male doesn't do very much of the incubation, as I mentioned, but he does do some. And this is an interesting photo because the male's got a young chick there, in fact, probably 2, if not 3, and also an unhatched egg. And quite often the last egg to get laid doesn't actually hatch because there's just too many chicks underneath the female taking up that space that's available to keep them warm, and the egg gets chilled. But if it does hatch, it will actually be hatched 2 days later than all the others. All the first 3 hatch on the same day because the female lays them every 2 days, but she doesn't incubate them until she's done the 3rd one. So those first 3 eggs go along at the same speed. If there's any more eggs, they will hatch later. So sometimes those very small chicks don't make it at all because they end up becoming breakfast for some of the chicks. It's a bit of a tough life being a bird of prey, I'm afraid. And we do ring the chicks very often. Here's a bird which unfortunately fell over. We propped it up and it just toppled backwards. So you can just see the enormous legs they have. They really are powerful. And if you can see there, they've got 4 claws, and that back claw, the one that's facing inwards, is actually incredibly powerful. That's the one they use to actually kill the prey. So they hit the prey with the talons open. They use that back claw to rip the body open, and the front 3 claws come forward just to hold it so that it doesn't fall to the ground. I mentioned we ring the chicks, which is quite important in monitoring what they do. All of our Hampshire chicks have got orange rings on. So look out for these large plastic rings. They're not very heavy, even though they are big. And they very helpfully hold these up quite often for us to have a look at. And here's an example where you can see the ring quite clearly. And you can see them when they fly over as well, which is great because they're big numbers on letters on these rings, so you can see that where they've come from. So if you see any like that, let me know, because they're bound to be one of ours. All kinds of nesting locations. So for example, pylons I've mentioned, buildings of course, chimneys where they first started, 1 or 2 quarries as well, and also some on the shingle. Now this is very unusual indeed. We in Hampshire have the only ground nesting peregrines in the whole of the UK. And in the Arctic, they do nest on the ground, but they don't nest on the ground elsewhere in Europe. So this is very, very unusual. And what I do know is that some of the birds that are nesting on the ground are related to some of the others. So in other words, they were born on the ground, and perhaps that's why they think it's the right thing to do to then nest on the ground. So here's a typical quarry nest in a hole. In this particular case, it was made by a friend of mine about 15 years ago in the hope that kestrels would nest. And they never did, but peregrines moved in, and there are the chicks in that hole, ready with their rings on. Here's the Fawley refinery, the big chimney, the biggest of the chimneys in Fawley refinery, and they did nest on one of those rings that's around the outside of the chimney, but they're very narrow, only a few inches wide, so they failed completely. Pleased to say, Exxon were very cooperative, and we got that box winched up very quickly and put where I've put the arrow there. So that's one nest. There are now 2 pairs of peregrines nesting inside Fawley refinery, in addition to the pair that were nesting on the power station. And as I mentioned, quite a lot nesting on pylons. Now the left-hand pylon is what we call a suspension tower. It's where the insulators hang down vertically, but the one on the right is what's called a tension tower, and they are only found in places where the line is going to change direction. So if it's coming in from the left and it's then got to go straight up north, so it's coming from the west and it's going to go north, that's the kind of tower they'll have. And quite often they have spaces where peregrines can get in. And there's an example, peregrine sitting inside that space. Those are the spaces that National Grid have more recently blocked off, so they can't do that. But there are plenty that still do have a hole, and peregrines love them. And they also like nesting on pylons anyway. This is up near Highbridge. This is a raven nest, but it's sometimes used by peregrines. And indeed, I think in 1 year, ravens and peregrines both managed to use the nest in 1 year. I think the ravens started in December, peregrines started in March, and it's a very, very productive nest. And here's a ground nest. So here they are, just up from the high water mark. Quite a risky strategy. Good chance you could get washed by a high tide. And indeed, 3 pairs of peregrines nested on the ground this year, and all 3 of them got washed and drowned. Well, the chicks or the eggs got washed away. The last weekend, I think it was in May, where there was so much heavy wind and rain, 80-mile-an-hour winds, I seem to remember. But it's quite a good strategy because you don't find too many foxes on islands and things like that. And here's where the RSPB put some sandbags to create a nesting place for terns, not far from Lymington. And you can probably just see there, yeah, peregrines got in there first, and here are the peregrine chicks that were nesting there. So yeah, they're changing their habits quite a bit, nesting at ground level. So I thought I'd focus a little bit on the story in Southampton as I'm talking to you tonight. And Southampton has played a big role for peregrines. For many years, of course, they've been on the Civic Centre tower. Now, they don't nest there. There is a nest box for them in case they want to, but it's not the tallest building around there. And the one thing I have learned about peregrines is if there are buildings, they will always go to the tallest one. So I'm afraid I don't think they're ever going to nest on the Civic Centre, but there is a camera up there, and I know the council are very keen to get some video of them when they're there. This is the container port. I'm very lucky to be given access to this on a regular basis, and I can go in to where these huge cranes are. They are amazing because these cranes are on railway lines, and you can see the yellow part is actually a train. So they move up and down the line, and those cranes could be anywhere along a sort of 1 kilometre stretch of line. Well, a pair of peregrines nested on this near one, closest to where I am. I have to say, it made it quite amusing when I sent my return back into the BTO, because I'm supposed to put a very precise 6-figure grid reference. In fact, if I can put 10 figures, they'd like it. And of course, I had to give them a range of grid references based on where the crane had been. So anywhere along the following line. So it's probably the only mobile nest, truly mobile nest in the country, although I know a pair nest on Jodrell Bank, and of course that the radar thing does swing round from left to right. That's also mobile, but I think we have the only real mobile nest. But unfortunately, what happened in 2012 is that they nested on a natural nest made by crows the previous year of bits of wire and twine, and I'm afraid this is the chick. The chick got caught up in the wire, and it ended up getting in a terrible mess, and it died. So I was called, and I came in, and here's the box that we made. This is our standard size box, and so it's used by many of us who work on peregrines. If you've got a Ford Focus, one thing you might want to know is this is just about 2 millimeters wider than a Ford Focus, which is worth knowing because I didn't realize it, and I did have a Ford Focus, and I pushed it in, and I then couldn't get the box out. So for about a month, the box was in my car, and eventually we cut the box open into 2 parts. So now we make them slightly smaller. We put gravel in the bottom in order to, usually a bit more thin and soft than this. And then the box goes up on the crane. So this is on the crane itself. This is a rather grainy photo from the first year, so 2014, when we got the birds nesting. And here they are with 4 eggs on the 26th of March. And here they are a few years later with snow in the box, and yet they're actually already displaying. It's just the male and female bowing to each other. Very, very nice to see that. but snow all over the place. So that's one site. Here's another site where they started nesting at the same time in 2013. This is at the port. So this is basically the grain silos just up by where all the cruise ships come in. And they nest currently, normally anyway, where that arrow is. But you see the big gantry to the left. I'm not even sure if that's still there now, but that gantry, they nested on the top of that certainly once. And that gantry was going to come down. So we put a box up on the silos, and that's where they do regularly nest. So these vertical sort of metal chutes for all the seed, that's where, next to those is where they are. Now, it is an unbelievably noisy place. I couldn't bear being there for more than about half an hour, and I have to do it every year for one day. But they did nest there. They liked it a lot, and it's very interesting. They will put up with a lot of noise. So this is the female. She has the initials AP on her orange ring. Now, although we use orange rings, they also use them in Surrey and London, and she is a London peregrine. She was born about 10 years ago now, and she moved down to Hampshire, and that was the first place she nested, so about 7 or 8 years ago. And she nests almost every year in that place where the silos are. But one year, even though we put a nice box there for her, she found a place where there was a hole in the conveyor belt that was taking all the seed, because it's a seed silo and a grain silo. And she had a massive pile of grain, and she was sitting on these eggs that she laid in a pile of grain. And she was sitting there with grain falling on her every day. No, I don't know why they do these things, but she put up with that. You might notice that one of the eggs is pale, looks like a chicken egg. That's quite common. So the first 3 eggs that the peregrine lays are dark and speckly, and quite often the final one has no marks on it at all. Now, we don't know whether that's because the female runs out of pigmentation, or whether it's some cue for her to know that that's the egg that she might actually not bother to incubate. Very odd, but it's a regular thing with peregrine nests. Anyway, one of those chicks did survive, I'm pleased to say, and here's one of the workers, absolutely delighted that we managed to get that chick to fledging. The next nest, of course, is here, and as I say, they always like the tallest places. So this is the tallest building in the centre of Southampton. I'm sure you all know it, right next to the railway station, Norwich Tower. This is currently being renovated internally. Not quite sure when the roof will be renovated, but when that happens, the peregrines will probably have to have a year off. But that corner point where I put the arrow is where the nest is. And I have access, I have permission to go up there every year. And quite often see the bird sitting on the corner. Mike was mentioning to me just now that he saw the female up there the other day. Here she is. She's a beauty, wonderful looking bird. And she has there's this sort of girder, metal girders that go around the inside of the building. This is where they hang the baskets which they use to wash the windows with, but they're not washing the windows now. And her chick is in there just underneath. She has chicks most years, but she's not done so well in the last few years. In 2020, unfortunately, her male died. He was found dead at the station. And so she had to do the whole thing on her own. And as a result of that, I'm afraid she didn't manage to rear any chicks, but she did in 2021. She had a new male come in, and here's her chick from this year. Just one chick reared, as far as I know. Little bit of drama. AP, that's the bird that's colour ringed that's at the silos. So in 2021, the silos were being renovated, and so her box, which we made for her, got blocked off. And she moved with her male from the port over to the docks where the cranes are. Now, there were no other peregrines in the docks this year. So here she is. This is a photograph we took of her in the spring. We've got a camera inside the box. So no end of drama this year. The male is supposed to take over from the female because she does all the overnight stints. And he's supposed to come in at sort of 6 o'clock and do an hour or so on the eggs whilst the female goes out and hunts. But for whatever reason, he didn't. And on the 23rd of April, a carrion crow came in. We've got it all on film and basically took all 4 of the eggs. So that was the end of that, we thought. But actually, no, she then laid a second clutch of eggs, which I was quite surprised about because it was late. Normally, they don't bother if they lose their eggs at that stage, but she laid 4 more eggs, which is a lot of effort, frankly. So she laid 4 more eggs, and then more drama. 27th of May, she eats 2 of the eggs. So we were watching her and we could see her very clearly eating 2 of her eggs. Now, there are reasons sometimes why peregrines will eat their eggs. For example, if they accidentally spike one with a claw, they could, if they maybe get frightened off the nest, and they break it. But this was not that. This was actually, she just decided to eat 2 of her eggs. And I think this is because she realized it was so late now in the season. Instinctively, she knew she wouldn't have enough energy or time to rear 4 chicks. She only had time to rear 2. And in the end, she only reared 1 because one of those eggs didn't hatch. But that is the one bird, and fabulous looking bird. I remember this moment very much. It's one of the real payback moments for somebody who spends hours watching peregrines, is to get to spend a bit of time with them up close like this. I thought I'd quickly also tell you a little bit about Winchester, because that's another place where I've been working a lot. You've probably all seen that we've got cameras on the nests at Winchester, which you can watch live during the breeding season. So the story there quickly is that we have Winnie, a wonderful looking female peregrine. And we did have up until this year, Chester, her male, who sadly died halfway through the season when she had chicks, but Winnie managed to carry on feeding them okay. And they are a great pair, or they have been a great pair. This is Chester seeing off a buzzard that's come too close to the nest. But before they nested on the cathedral, they were actually nesting on the police HQ. And this is no longer in existence, but back in 2011, that's where they were nesting, and you could see them, and just see them circled there in red, sitting up the top. It's a safe place to nest because no one's going to climb up the police HQ to steal your eggs. And we put a box up there because if you see the gully that's on the right-hand side there, they tried to nest in the gully. And of course, that was disaster. Every time it rained, the gully would fill with water. So we put a box up. We had to tie it down because it's a pretty windy place. And indeed, we had to tie ourselves down. It was so windy as well, had to wear harnesses. And very quickly, we had chicks in that box just a few weeks later. And here they are, the female chick on the left, male chick on the right. She's already bigger than him, but that could also be because he may have been a little bit younger. But the police HQ had to be demolished for housing to be moved in. And we quickly worked out that they were very interested in this part of the cathedral. So this is the north side, and that is the rose window, that big circular window, and they nest just below there. And my colleague Richard Jacobs worked out really quickly that that's where they were going to nest. And we went up and had a look. There is the gully. Yet again, they've gone for a gully. So we predicted that if we didn't actually manage to get a nesting tray in, they'd probably face disaster again. Now, it's a bit different trying to get a tray or a box onto a listed building than it is onto a police HQ. So we weren't able to get agreement straight away. And unfortunately, exactly what we predicted happened, and she nested and her eggs got washed away. So that was a disaster. But the next year, we managed to get a box up there, a tray up there. Here it is. And here are the first year's chicks. So 2 chicks there, just waiting to be ringed. You can see the sharpness of those talons. You really don't want to have a peregrine handshake. Much better to be pecked by one. You're not going to end up being hurt by that. And there are the chicks on the tray. And there they are a bit later when they've grown up. And a typical peregrine year, early March, bit of display around the tray, male and female together. They very rarely go close to each other, as I mentioned, but and even when they sit, for example, first laid eggs there, they still don't sit next to each other. They space themselves out. And then a bit later, here they are, a bit closer together now. One's got food, that's why. And you can see the first chick has hatched. So that's usually about 25th or 27th of April. By the middle of May, we've got bundles of chicks in the nest, like that. A bit later, we've got chaos everywhere because the chicks are running around, they're off the tray. Little bit of a design fault. We didn't think about this. We had to put the tray on stilts because it's in a gully that's going to get wet. So we should have thought about putting a ladder for them. They've got a ladder now, but there was a time in the first year where they would jump off the tray and then not be able to get back on again. So I'd have to go up every time and put them back in on the tray. But if you've got it right, you end up having young peregrine chicks sitting along all the walls waiting to be fed by early June, which is a great thing to see. This is Chester feeding a young chick. Food being brought in every sort of 15 minutes to half an hour. 2020 was an amazing year because there we have 5 chicks. So we had 5 eggs, 5 chicks, and I think they all fledged as well. So an amazing year. And you can see the step ladder we put in as well, which has been very successful. And here's Winnie feeding the chicks. They all come along and sort of queue up, waiting to be fed. The strongest ones go to the front. But, you know, peregrines can only eat a certain amount before the crop is full. And then that bird that's got a full crop will then move to one side. So everybody gets fed, so long as there's plenty of food. And there they are, 5 of them there spread out. Early June is a bit chaotic, I can tell you, because birds are forever, young birds are trying to fly for the first time. And if you're on a building like a cathedral, you can run up and down that gully, but you've eventually got to fly. And they quite often end up landing in amongst tourists out in the green. And we have to collect them back up again and put them back up on the gully. So we had this happen last year. We had a bird come down, a load of tourists were sitting on the grass, suddenly were joined by a peregrine. And here they are waiting to be fed. There's Winnie coming in with food. And there's Chester, who's already smaller than one of his chicks, because as I said, males are very small. This is the female, one of the female chicks, and she's only, what, 6 weeks old, and she's already bigger than he is. And one of the greatest things is to watch them when mock battles, but they also chase after the female, who will dangle a bit of food and they'll have to try and get it off her. So yeah, wonderful Angel of the North shot there by Richard Jacobs of one of our young peregrines. I had a lot of help with photographs from my friends in order to put that talk together, and there they are listed. And I thought I'd just finish with my favorite peregrine nest, not in Hampshire. This one's in Chicago, and it's on an apartment block where this man found peregrines nesting in his window box one year, and there they are, the chicks. They're just, you know, the peregrines are completely used to being part of his bedroom, basically, and they look in at him and he looks out at them. I love the look on that chick. That third chick along is obviously totally amazed by what's going on. So yeah, thank you very much indeed for listening. And Mike, I'm going to hand back to you. I'll stop sharing and I'll let you now share the questions, or people can simply speak up if that's what they'd like to do.